Why do some people learn any skill in record time while others struggle for years without making progress? Why doesn't studying more always mean learning better? And why, even though you try everything, do you still feel like you're falling behind? The real problem isn't your intelligence or your discipline, but the way you've been taught to learn. And there is a silent mistake that almost everyone makes without realizing it. Stay tuned because understanding this can change everything. From a young age, we are taught that learning consists of sitting, listening, reading, and taking notes. We are told that the more time we spend consuming information, the smarter we will become. But this idea, although it seems logical, is one of the biggest lies about learning. Think about how many times you've watched an educational video, read an entire book, or highlighted whole pages of notes. At that moment, you feel like you understand everything. The ideas seem familiar, even obvious. But when you try to apply that knowledge on your own, something fails. You don't remember the steps, you hesitate, you block. That feeling is not a coincidence. Passive learning creates a dangerous illusion. Your brain confuses recognition with understanding. By seeing a clear explanation, by reading a well-written sentence, you feel that you know it, when in reality you are only recognizing it. It's like watching someone cook and believing you already know how to prepare the dish until you enter the kitchen and don't know where to start. The original content makes it clear. The problem isn't that you're bad at learning, but that you've been trained to learn in a way that doesn't work. Seeing, listening, and reading are comfortable activities. They don't demand real effort from the brain. And without effort, the brain has no reason to change or to strengthen itself. That's why so many people spend years learning a language without being able to speak it, or consume entire courses without truly improving. It's not a lack of willpower, it's the method. The brain needs difficulty to learn. It needs to make mistakes, to doubt, to try to retrieve information without help. Here is the key that many ignore. If learning always feels easy and pleasant, you're probably not truly learning. Real progress is usually uncomfortable. It makes you feel slow, clumsy, even frustrated. But that discomfort is precisely the sign that your brain is working. This first idea sets the stage for everything that comes after. Because if you don't abandon passive learning, no trick, technique, or tip will work. Before learning faster, you need to learn in a different way. Most people are terrified of forgetting. When you don't remember something you studied yesterday, you assume you failed. You think you wasted your time, that your memory is bad, or that you're simply not cut out for learning. But this way of thinking is exactly what keeps you stuck. The original content explains a counterintuitive truth. Forgetting is not the enemy of learning. It is an essential part of it. The brain is not designed to store everything permanently. It forgets selectively to save energy, and it only keeps what it considers truly important. When you review the same information over and over again, you are telling your brain that it doesn't need to make an effort. Everything is there, available. There is no urgency, no challenge. Instead, when you let time pass and then try to remember without help, you force the brain to work. That effort is what strengthens memory. This is where many people go wrong. They review, reread, watch the same video again, believing that this is how they fix knowledge. In reality, they are only reinforcing the illusion of knowing. Real learning happens when you try to remember and fail a little. Every attempt, even an incorrect one, sends a clear signal to the brain. This is important, don't delete it. Forgetting creates the necessary space to build knowledge again. And every time you rebuild it, you make it more solid. It's like a muscle that strengthens with resistance, not with comfort. The problem is emotional. Forgetting feels bad. It generates insecurity. But that discomfort is not a sign of inability, but of progress. People who learn quickly do not avoid forgetting. They use it to their advantage. They expose themselves to it in a controlled way. When you understand this, your relationship with learning changes completely. You stop seeking to feel secure all the time and start looking for signs of real effort. You accept that forgetting doesn't mean moving backward, but moving forward. This idea connects directly to the next part, because it's not enough to accept forgetting. You need to know how to trigger that effort in the right way, without falling into chaos or constant frustration. If passive learning is the trap and forgetting is part of the process, then the key question is this: What method actually works? The source content points to a clear and forceful answer: active recall. Active recall consists of forcing yourself to pull information out of your mind without supports, without looking at notes, without rereading, without going back to the video. Just you, your memory, and the question. And although it may seem ineffective at first, this method is one of the most powerful for lasting learning. When you try to remember something on your own, your brain enters a state of maximum effort. It doesn't recognize, it searches, it doesn't copy, it reconstructs. That process strengthens neural connections much more than any passive repetition. Even when you're wrong, the simple attempt already generates learning. Here, another common mistake appears. Many people believe it only counts when they remember correctly. But the original content makes it clear that failing also teaches. Every mistake reveals a specific weakness, and that weakness is a direct opportunity for improvement. After trying to remember, checking the correct answer has a huge impact because the brain compares, adjusts, and corrects. This method explains why exams, when used well, help learning more than studying does. Not because they evaluate, but because they force the retrieval of information under pressure. The problem isn't the exam, but studying only to avoid failing instead of using the failure as a tool. Active recall also changes your perception of progress. You no longer measure if the content sounds familiar to you, but if you can explain it without help. If you can't express it in your own words, you haven't mastered it yet. This is a tough but honest rule. Applying this requires courage. It means accepting moments of silence, of doubt, of blockage. But right there is where real learning happens. Not when everything flows, but when it's hard. This part is fundamental because it sets the stage for something even more important. How to organize those efforts over time so that learning is not lost, but consolidated almost permanently. Many people believe that learning fast means studying for more hours in a row. The original content completely dismantles this idea. It's not the amount of time that makes the difference, but how that time is distributed. This is where spaced repetition comes into play. Spaced repetition is based on a simple but powerful principle. The brain remembers better when information is reviewed just before it's forgotten. Not too soon, because there's no effort. Not too late, because it's lost completely. That middle ground is where learning consolidates. When you study everything all at once, you feel like you're making a lot of progress. But that feeling is deceptive. In reality, the information fades quickly. Instead, when you return to a concept after 1, 2, or several days, you force the brain to reconstruct it. Every reconstruction makes it more resistant to forgetting. The source content explains that this process not only saves time but multiplies it. 5 well-spaced minutes can be more effective than an hour of continuous study. The key isn't in the momentary intensity, but in strategic consistency. Another important point is that spaced repetition doesn't mean repeating exactly the same thing. It means facing the content again from different angles, explaining it in your own words, answering different questions, applying it in new contexts. Each variation strengthens the network of memories. Many people give up here because progress doesn't feel immediate. There isn't a strong sense of advancement, but rather small, quiet victories. But over time, the effect is enormous. Knowledge stops being fragile and starts feeling stable, accessible even after weeks or months. This part connects directly with the previous one. Active recall works best when combined with spaced repetition. They aren't separate methods, but pieces of the same system. One generates effort, the other distributes it over time. Understanding this completely changes the way you study. You stop looking for productivity marathons and start building sustainable habits. And right here, the final question arises: how to apply all of this without burning out or giving up in the attempt? Many believe the problem with not learning is a lack of discipline. The original content proposes a different and much more uncomfortable idea. It's not a lack of discipline, it's that the system is poorly designed. No one can sustain a method that goes against the natural functioning of the brain for very long. When learning is based solely on willpower, fatigue eventually sets in. Studying becomes a constant struggle, and each session requires a disproportionate effort. This leads to procrastination, guilt, and finally, giving up. The source content explains that the brain learns better when it perceives real progress, not when continuous sacrifice is demanded of it. Motivation doesn't arise before starting. It appears after seeing results. Therefore, a good system must generate frequent, small wins. This is where the importance of reducing friction comes in. If studying requires too many steps, too much preparation, or too much time, the brain interprets it as a threat. Instead, when access to learning is simple and clear, resistance decreases. Another key point is separating identity from performance. Many people conclude they aren't smart when they fail, when in reality they're just using an ineffective method. The original content insists that changing the system changes the result, even with the same abilities. This approach also redefines consistency. It's not about studying for hours every day, but about not breaking the chain. A short day counts. A quick review counts. What destroys progress is not low intensity, but total interruption. Learning stops being a heroic act and becomes a normal process, something that fits into real life with good days and bad days. This perspective reduces pressure and, paradoxically, increases persistence. All of this leads us to one final essential reflection. What happens when you understand learning not as an event, but as a continuous process that evolves with you? At this point, the original content takes a deep turn. It no longer talks only about techniques, but about how you see yourself. Real change happens when learning stops being something you do and becomes something you are. Many people study with an external goal, an exam, a degree, a quick result. But when that goal disappears, the habit does too. The source content points out that this is why so much knowledge is lost over time. Instead, when learning is integrated into identity, it no longer depends on daily motivation. You don't study because you have to, but because it's consistent with who you are. The question stops being, do I feel like it, and becomes, what small step am I taking today? This transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's built through repeated experiences of real understanding. Every time you remember something without effort, every time you connect ideas, the brain reinforces the belief that learning is possible and natural. Another important point is that this identity is not based on perfection. The original content emphasizes that making mistakes is part of the process. The error stops being a sign of inability and becomes information. Here the circle closes with everything that came before. Active recall, spaced repetition, and simple systems not only improve memory, but also change the emotional relationship with learning. Fear decreases, curiosity increases. When this happens, time stops being an enemy. You no longer feel like you're wasting hours studying, but rather investing minutes that accumulate. Progress may be slow, but it's stable. Continuous learning also generates a powerful side effect: confidence. Not a confidence based on knowing everything, but on knowing that you can learn whatever you need when you need it. Only one final piece remains to completely close this journey. A conclusion that doesn't promise miracles, but something much more valuable: control over your mental process. Upon reaching this point, the original content makes a central message clear. It was never a lack of ability, nor of intelligence, nor even of discipline. The real problem was always the approach. For years, you were taught to memorize without understanding, to repeat without connecting, and to demand immediate results from a brain that learns in a different way. When you put all the previous pieces together, the picture changes completely. Learning doesn't depend on studying more hours, but on respecting how the mind works. It's not about constant willpower, but about small systems that sustain themselves over time. The source text insists on something fundamental. The brain is not broken. It's perfectly designed to learn, as long as it's given the right environment. When you reduce the load, when you fragment information, and when you return to it at the right time, learning stops feeling heavy. Another key point of the closing is patience. Not the passive patience of waiting for results, but the active patience of trusting the process. Real changes aren't always noticed day by day, but they become evident when you look back. Suddenly you remember concepts effortlessly. Suddenly you explain ideas clearly. Suddenly you understand connections that previously seemed impossible. The original content also dismantles a dangerous belief: constant comparison. Each brain moves at its own pace, and measuring your progress against others only breeds frustration. The only real indicator is this: today you understand a little more than yesterday. In the end, learning stops being a source of anxiety and becomes a tool to adapt, to grow, and to not feel overwhelmed by a fast-changing world. You don't need to know everything, you just need to know that you can learn whatever is necessary. This closing doesn't promise miracle shortcuts or instant transformations. It promises something more solid: clarity. Clarity on how you learn, why you failed before, and what to do from now on. And when you have clarity, fear loses its power. Because you no longer ask yourself if you're capable, but when you will start,